Coming up, we look into the Sandro Tonali situation in depth and what next for Eddie Howe and Newcastle United. So Eddie Howe and Newcastle United throwing their support around Sandro Tonali going into this weekend's game against Crystal Palace, where as it stands, he's available to play in the Premier League despite all of the stories, front page headlines in Italy and everything that's gone with. A tough week for the Italy midfielder who was withdrawn from the Azzurri squad last week in the build-up to the preparations for Euro 2024 qualifiers. And I would expect Newcastle to do everything they can to protect what's, at the end of the day, a £55 million signing from AC Milan. And, they've got to look at the long game. If he is going to be banned for a period of time, he's signed a long-term contract at Newcastle and they've got to look after the player and get him into the best possible state he can and get him back to, what he's good at doing on the pitch. And I think that's going to be the mantra from Eddie Howe. So no surprise for me that Eddie Howe supports the player, and it'll certainly be interesting to see if he does get on the pitch against Crystal Palace, exactly what that reception will be. I'm pretty sure it'll be positive, and it'll be one that Tonali will be able to take away with him for however long he's going to miss playing in a Newcastle United shirt. Newcastle will want to do everything they can to protect what they'll see as an asset. And look, that's exactly what he is, because, when Newcastle signed him, he was a £50 million player and, he remains a £50 million player. And this isn't going to be a long-term thing compared to his contract. If you were looking at it, if you were trying to be philosophical about it from Tonali's point of view, it's almost like him getting an injury and he's going to miss a sustained amount of time on the pitch. But for Newcastle, they're going to have to cope without him. And for the player, he's going to have to get himself ready. But I do think sometimes with footballers, they can come back doubly determined to prove people wrong almost, if anyone has judged his character in this situation. I think there's a lot of players in the past who've come back from bans. Most notably, I think Eric Cantona back in the day came back twice the player almost, and he was some player before that, and it was to Newcastle's cost as well in the title race back then. So players have a history of coming back to prove critics wrong, and I think Tonali will have that little bit of motivation in his locker when all this comes through. But for now, it's about focusing on that game against Crystal Palace. I think Eddie Howe, no surprise that he's thrown his support around the player. In my opinion, Eddie, since he came in, has been brilliant at that. He's been brilliant at improving the support network, the player network around. He's brought in player liaison officers to make players feel more comfortable. He's changed the training ground and he's tried to make it a better environment for the footballer, the under pressure footballer, which you're going to be at Newcastle when you come in. So all this adds up at the end of the day. Newcastle's still a work in progress under Eddie Howe, still a work in progress under new owners. And that, that's all relevant to this situation, because they've signed a player who's come here with clearly an issue, which his agent has gone on the record and said he's got an issue. And now they've got to work with a player. And it's not a case of just dismissing somebody. You can't do that. They've got to work with him. They've got to make sure they get the best from him. And then they've now got to look after him and support him and his family, which is exactly what Newcastle United have done admirably in the last few days, in the eye of a storm. It can't have been nice for Tonali, being on the front pages of the papers over in Italy. He's not the only one involved in this, but for some reason, the whole thing seems to have focused on him. The timing of it hasn't been ideal, coming to the end of an international break. And really, this has been the only story that the media have kind of had to focus on. So it's not been great for him. I think if he does play against Crystal Palace, he'll get that warmth from the supporters. I think if you do delve into social media, the majority of people seem to be being supportive of the player anyway. And for me, that's got to be deemed a positive. I think as well, on a wider point, everyone's going on about betting in football, and I think football sometimes has to look at itself as well, because you've got all these sort of leagues and channels taking the sponsorship money from betting companies, and it's in the faces of the players. It's everywhere. And I think football does have to look in the mirror sometimes and almost take some accountability for that. You know, some countries you can't advertise betting. In this country, it's rife. It's everywhere. Everywhere you look, there's betting. There's ex-footballers going in with bookmakers, getting paid money to talk about football, and it's going to just bring it all into attention to a player. So I think there's a lot to learn from all of this, really. I don't think it's singly down to Tonali. I think there's so much to learn from it in football. And when the dust settles on this, a bit like the Ivan Toney situation, I think the player comes back stronger from it. I think Ivan Toney has already started to show he can come back stronger from this, playing in practice games and all that sort of thing. And I think eventually Tonali will get to that point himself and hopefully comes back the better player, because it's been a very tough, testing, educating episode for him. And I think really Newcastle will have learned a lot from it. Tonali will have learned a lot from it. And Tonali will learn a lot from the club he's playing for now, with that support that he's going to be getting. So there are positives and negatives, but ultimately a player is facing a stint on the sideline for a long time. Thankfully, he looks like he's facing up to the situation he's in. And again, we've seen players come back from this, and hopefully this can be another example of that.